Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar of the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. This actually is the last webinar of the 2017-18 academic year, and I'm extremely pleased to have Alex Wolitz from Stanford University join us to discuss George Orwell's 1984 and the art of political writing. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm pleased to join you from my home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I work as the Vice President for Education at the National Humanities Center. And for the last 25 sessions this year, back since early September 2017, I've always appreciated your willingness to leave your classrooms at the end of the day, go home, interact with your family, have your dinner, and then come and join us for these kinds of conversations. I want to thank you here at the end of the session for your ongoing commitment and dedication to these conversations. To date, we have served about 4,800 teachers in our webinar series, and I'm just ecstatic that we're able to have these conversations with lead scholars and experts in their fields around these very compelling topics. As you know, these webinars are audio and PowerPoint associated, so you'll be hearing our voices, you'll be reading along with us on the screen, but the best way for you to interact with us is at the chat box, which is located at the bottom of the Go to Training control panel. And I'd like you to use that chat box not just to greet each other, as I hope you're doing now, but also to register thoughts, to respond to questions that we might give you, to share resources, and to let us know how you handle these very complicated topics in your own classrooms and the kind of reactions you get from your students. So take a moment while I'm doing my orientation and my welcome to say hello to everybody else in the room with us, shake your neighbor's hand, let us know where you're teaching and what subject you're teaching, and again, we would love to hear from you as the night goes on. At the end of tonight's session, you will have a chance to complete a survey, and after completing that survey, you'll be prompted to download your certificate for attendance. That certificate is meant to reflect both the hour that you spent with us tonight, but also the time that you put in reading the pre-webinar materials and even interacting with the materials afterwards. The National Humanities Center is now in our 40th year. 2018 is our four decades of humanities work in Durham, North Carolina. Our primary focus is the support of a fellowship class of 35 to 40 university academics who come to Durham, and they do their good work in the humanities every year. From Labor Day to Memorial Day, they write books, they edit materials, they do research, they have conversations with each other. More likely and more recently, they do digital projects. And all of that is meant to enhance the world we live in by giving us a much deeper understanding of the humanities. Our education department then creates bridges in which educators and researchers and scholars can speak together around the real value of this work. And it strikes me that our primary motive and our primary goal really is to be able to articulate that the humanities, history, philosophy, literature, art history, music, etc., that these aren't luxuries. These aren't things that we take on the side while we're really preparing ourselves for the careers and the jobs and the vocations that we have. Instead, humanities are real tools for understanding our world. They're blueprints, they're maps, they're echoes of the past sometimes and often of the present that allow us to make sense of these complexities. I hope you find in all of our work, our instructional materials, our webinar series, and other initiatives that we sponsor at the center, that we're really trying to provide you with a deeper understanding so that you can then work with your younger students and activate that same understanding. I encourage you to visit our free online materials, americainclass.org. You can download lessons and instructional materials. I think you'll find in the coming 6 months or so that our site and the way that you access these materials will change quite a bit. Our work will always be free and open, but we're very much expanding into new disciplines. We're inviting new experts in new fields to come and contribute to our repository, and I'm anxious to be able to share that with you at the beginning of the next school year. Our webinar series, again, has been very successful, and for me, a lot of fun to be able to connect scholars and teachers around these conversations. We have completed the schedule for our 2018-19 school year. We've got 25 wonderful topics lined up with scholars from all over the country. Just as a sneak peek, you'll be able to sign up for webinars that address topics like the myths of Game of Thrones, the debate of the Second Amendment, taxes and race, 1968, this is our 50th anniversary of the year 1968 and all that happened then, addiction in America, modern slavery, and the history of hip hop. We'll have many other webinars available for your registration as well. And we plan to open that registration on August the 13th, 2018 at 10 a.m. East Coast time. What we're finding is that we are reaching capacity on many of our webinars, including tonight's. We reached that threshold of 200 pretty quickly. So we're going to release and open the registration on that date at that time. And I hope you set your clock, put it in your iCal, and you can join us to sign up for as many as seem relevant and interesting to you. I'd also encourage you to go to iTunes and download our recent publication titled Humanities in Class, A Guide to Thinking and Learning in the Humanities. Our intent by assembling these 10 scholars and teachers was to really articulate the value of these 10 disciplines. Our acknowledgement is that each discipline has its own unique set of resources and questions and tools and approaches, but that there's also a lot in common between these disciplines. And in a very multimedia and interactive final delivery as an iBook, I think we're able to really give you a lot of clear guidance on the ways that each of these fields do their work. I find it to be a very useful tool in trying to describe this thinking and researching and learning process to younger students, and I would encourage you to download it for free and figure out ways to share it with your younger students. Finally, we have also opened the application process for our 2018-19 Teacher Advisory Council. This past year, I've had the privilege of working with these 14 educators who have been fantastic collaborators. They represent different districts and disciplines and regions from across the country, and they give us their feedback and make sure that what we're doing is relevant for the modern classroom. If you're interested in this process, you can go to our website and navigate through education programs to see the application process. I put the URL on the screen there as well. And we would like to receive your application by May the 11th. We'll make our selections and notify our new cohort by Memorial Day and make that transition over the summer. So if you're interested in that, please go to our website. Feel free to email me as well with questions. So all of that is an orientation and a thank you for your continued work and contributions and collaborations with the National Humanities Center. I'm very pleased to host tonight's webinar because, like many of the things that we do, we really try to make this relevant. We try to make it contemporary. And I don't think it's a mistake that George Orwell's 1984 is not just a common title on many high school reading lists. It's taught in a curricular way all across the country, but it's really one of those pieces of art that also has an extracurricular meaning. I don't think it's a mistake that in January of 2017, suddenly George Orwell's 1984 is back on the Amazon top sellers list. It's in the top 5. That's double plus good, really, that it would be able to sort of regain that kind of momentum. But it's not just contemporary and more recent events. In 2013, you might recall, 1984 also returned to the bestsellers list when Edward Snowden gave us the revelations of the real depth of surveillance of the NSA. So there's so many contemporary, there's so many sort of current event, waking up and putting our feet on the floor moments that 1984 seems to allude to, seems to maybe offer some insights around. And I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Alice Wallace from Stanford University to walk us through this conversation. Alice, can you hear me out in Palo Alto?
I can hear you, yes, and hopefully Fantastic. Everyone can hear me.
Well, thank you for joining us. My job as moderator will be to keep an eye on the chat box, and I'm going to sprinkle some questions in as you go along, but I am also going to give you control of the mouse and ask you to lead us in this conversation. So you should have that power now, and yeah.
Oops, I used my power too much, I think. Okay, so
use your power for good.
So I just started with the caption I wrote for the NHC, and I'll just read it now. The year 1984 is now almost as far back in our past as it was far into Orwell's future when he published his novel in 1948. And we can speculate that he just got to the title by reversing the date of 1948, and that created 1984. The book, unlike the year, has not simply dated. On the contrary, it seems to surge back into contemporary relevance in the last year, briefly topping the bestseller list. Just after the 2017 presidential inauguration, Orwell's novel then continues to hold political and literary significance far outside of the Cold War context of its early reception. in his essay, Why I Write, Orwell wrote, "What I have most wanted to do throughout the past 10 years is to make political writing into an art." Uh, so we can start by thinking about that, the way that the novel has kind of changed over the years, and particularly that it kind of flared into new significance in the last 2 years. And I think on the one hand, it's a novel as much as almost any that's tied to a very specific context. I mean, Orwell is writing this in 1948, and he has his aims in mind in a Cold War context, and yet there's elements of what he did in writing this text that seem to resonate far beyond that moment. So I'm interested in what that says about the novel as a piece of writing, and we're also interested to think about, like, has the experience of reading the novel and particularly teaching the novel changed for people in the last 2 years. So some of the guiding questions for tonight will be, how do we understand 1984 as a deliberately crafted work of writing? How can we connect it to Orwell's previous 15 years as a prolific and experimental writer? So I kind of want us to situate this as I mean, Orwell dies pretty young, and he dies the year after 1984 is published. But it's far from the only thing that he wrote. And what I'm interested in thinking about tonight is that kind of active sense of writing and the challenges of writing and the possibilities of writing. So the third question are just, what strategies and techniques, what literary strategies and imaginative techniques underlie the tricky art of engaging politics through writing?
Professor, if you don't, may I ask you a quick question before you
Sure.
get into the guiding questions?
Yes.
And I don't mean to take you too far astray, but I'm interested and I'm curious because we have this national audience of teachers now, and I've seen several of them comment that they're literally teaching this book right now, and they've been looking forward to this all year.
Yeah.
Do you remember when you first read it, how old you were, and what your response was?
Yeah, I do. I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, I was one of those high school students who read the book in 1984. So I would have been 14 at the time, and I'm pretty sure that I read it, and there was a certain kind of interest in reading it at that point. And so I'm very much the kind of classic reader of this book, having kind of read it in eighth grade or ninth grade.
Right. And did you like it? Do you remember your initial reaction as a young adolescent?
Yeah, I definitely liked it. I mean, it's a good novel. I mean, I remember being drawn into it, and being, enjoying it, and sort of, I guess, agreeing with it. Like, it made an impression. But for me, it was then, a number of years later, that I kind of circled back to Orwell and got interested in his writing much more generally. And then you can see different things about 1984, when you kind of so I think it's very typical that people come to Orwell through these two late novels he writes, Animal Farm and 1984. And then later on kind of discover all this stuff that he had written earlier, for the most part. Um,
Well, thank you. I just had this deep sense all of a sudden of a time shift of some kind that I was interested in that. Thank you.
yeah, no, it's super interesting. I mean, do you remember when you first read it,
Yeah,
Andy?
I was in middle school as well. Although I remember having it. I remember my father giving it to me more than I remember reading it in a class.
Yeah, that's
But I
interesting.
do remember
That's
trying to
interesting.
teach it, and I remember, you know, at, at first what might seem inaccessible to kids just quickly grabs them, and I think there is something about that is both adult and adolescent all at the same time.
Yeah, and I will say, just as an interesting footnote, I mean, then this kind of gets to, like, that, all the different things Orwell writes, but he writes about, he's very interested in childhood reading, and he has this great essay on Gulliver's Travels, which he read on, like, the night before his eighth birthday. So so he also was like, and it's just, I mean, he sees Gulliver's Travels as this very important text to him in the way that 1984 might be for other people.
Right.
And this list, I'm just, so Peter Davison edited sort of the complete works of George Orwell in the early 2000s, and it did give a new perspective on him. And I just, on this slide, I'm just listing sort of where it falls in the number, and what's important here is just that high number, 3,643, and it's a little bit misleading because a lot of these are letters, but Orwell really was a prolific writer, and he wrote tons of important essays. And the other thing that's important is he really experimented with a lot of different forms. So when you get to 1984, the two things I think we want to think about in terms of just the practice of writing is that it's somebody who's very dedicated to the act of writing and is very interested in writing across different forms. And I mean, these are just some of the greatest hits that I picked out, all of which connect to 1984. So, I mean, just as an example, Homage to Catalonia is a really important book that he writes about 10 years earlier, that recounts his experience fighting with the government forces in Spain in the Republican battle against Franco, which was a kind of early precursor to fascism and eventually to World War II. And there's a lot about there's a lot about Orwell's idealism and also his sense of how language can be manipulated, how deception can be shot through with politics that you can see in Homage to Catalonia, his own experience with kind of Stalin's secret police. And so there's a direct line that we can draw between Homage to Catalonia and 1984. But that's true for so many of his texts. So, some of his essays, Politics in the English Language, which is a fairly well-known essay, has a lot of resonance with 1984. And so it's like Orwell's been doing this writing for basically 15 years. And there's all these different kinds of writing that he's done that all feed into writing this novel. And that's kind of what I wanted to emphasize. Because I do think it's not the only way to look at 1984, but it is really interesting to think of it as kind of like a work of writing. And another really important essay is Why I Write, which Orwell is writing in 1946. And I'm going to just talk about a few lines from this essay. And what I want everyone to think about is just how do they resonate with 1984. So I have not written a novel for 7 years, but I hope to write another fairly soon. It is bound to be a failure. Every book is a failure, but I do know with some clarity what kind of book I want to write. And that line, every book is a failure, is a really important one. And I don't think Orwell means that just sort of superficially. I think there's a kind of deep comment, and we could even think about, like, in what ways does 1984 fail, and why would a writer sort of want to understand his books as partially failures? And I think part of what he's getting at is that when you're talking about politics, there's not going to be one perfect book that has the answers, that has like that we can read and we can sort of think, okay, now we understand everything, or now we have a kind of point of view that we can kind of feel is completely complacent in. So I want us to hold on to that line, that every book is a failure. And here's another really important and famous line from Orwell: "Good prose is like a window pane." And that's this desire for clarity. In some ways, we can relate that maybe more easily to the novel that he's in the process of writing. And he is, when he writes his essay, he is in the middle of writing 1984. So there's sort of these lines sort of have two emphases. I mean, they bring out two emphases in Orwell, which is, on the one hand, his desire to connect writing directly to politics, to use writing as a way of like establishing a really strong political point of view. And on the other hand, his caution that there's always going to be a difference between a piece of writing and reality. And part of that is, I mean, when we read Animal Farm, we know that the allegorical nature of it. That he's not writing non-fictional accounts of totalitarianism. So this is the slightly longer quote for that same phrase. Writing a book is a horrible, exhausting struggle, like a long bout of some painful illness. And Orwell himself, by the way, is very ill when he writes 1984. And I mean, one way to interpret the pessimism and the darkness of 1984, and some critics have gone this route, is just to note that he really was kind of suffering his own illness. But I want to kind of emphasize this idea of writing as a struggle and as an effort. One would never undertake such a thing if one were not driven on by some demon whom one can neither resist or understand. And yet it is also true that one can write nothing readable unless one constantly struggles to efface one's own personality. Good prose is like a window pane. So you can see the way Orwell's invested in, writing having a clear purpose, and that it should give you sort of like, it should be able to directly and concretely kind of get its point of view across. At the same time as he's raising this idea that, like, when we write, we don't fully understand why we're writing. We can't be in a position of complete mastery over our own point of view. Here's a couple more comments about 1984. This is a statement that he releases after 1984 is published. And I mean, he releases this because he's worried that the novel is going to be misinterpreted, as a kind of anti-socialist track, where in fact Orwell, throughout his adult life, identifies as a socialist. So my recent novel, 1984, is not intended as an attack on socialism or on the British Labour Party, of which I am a supporter, but as a show up of the perversions to which a centralized economy is liable and which have already been partly realized in communism and fascism. And then this other really important line: the scene of the book is laid in Britain in order to emphasize that the English-speaking races are not innately better than anyone else, and that totalitarianism, if not fought against, could triumph anywhere. Andy, are there any questions you want to pose, or should I keep going?
No, I think you're doing a great job of setting this up, and I think putting it in context.
Yeah, so this is another line from Why I Write, where we get that sense of purpose. Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, as I understand it. So again, you can see Orwell's investment in the idea that writing should have a purpose, that it can have an intention, a political intention, that it should be able to sort of act like a window pane. And at the same time, you can see that kind of, I mean, just the fact that he's thinking about everything he's written and the kind of prolific effort, let's remember that line about the constant struggle, writing as a kind of practice that never fully succeeds.
Do you think that he would be surprised that 1984 is still a top 5 seller this many years later?
Yeah, I think he would be very surprised for several reasons. I mean, first of all, he has this curious position of sort of only arriving at any kind of fame, just as he was dying, basically. And I mean, one of the reasons he writes so much is just simply because it was a way of earning a living. So he was a journalist by necessity, and he wrote a lot of pieces, on spec and just for the income. And I think he's also, I mean, Orwell is someone that's more comfortable with failure than success. Just as one example of this, while a lot of people like moved out of London during the war and during the Blitz, Orwell actually moves back into London, like during the war. So I think he would be uncomfortable with success, and I think he would be uncomfortable with any ways that his own writing kind of turned into an orthodoxy. This right. Monumental sense of 1984 as kind of having the truth. So we can look at this line, actually. I mean, this is an essay he writes in 1940 on Charles Dickens, and Charles Dickens is another one of his favorites, along with Jonathan Swift. Another writer, actually, that is like famous for sort of being somebody that often you read in childhood. So, and he has these interesting lines. What people always demand of a popular novelist is that he shall write the same book over and over again, forgetting that a man who would write the same book twice could not even write it once. Any writer who is not utterly lifeless moves upon a kind of parabola, and the downward curve is implied in the upward one. And we can think about the tension here. Like on the one hand, Orwell thinks that like he wants his writing to be completely consistent, right? Everything he writes is written, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism. Everything since the Spanish Civil War. That date of 1936 has to do with his experience in Spain. And at the same time, he's very invested in the idea that a writer should be unpredictable, that a writer shouldn't write the same thing over and over again, that writing should be experimental, that it should change, that it should shift, that it shouldn't be easy to kind of simplify or categorize, And so there's an interesting tension between these two ideas of writing. And this is, I think, my final passage from Why I Write. And hopefully some of these are going to be resonant with reading 1984. I will only say that of late years, I have tried to write less picturesquely and more exactly. In any case, I find that by the time you have perfected any style of writing, you have always outgrown it. Animal Farm was the first book in which I tried, with full consciousness of what I was doing, to fuse political purpose and artistic purpose into one whole. I have not written a novel for 7 years, but I hope to write another fairly soon. It is bound to be a failure. Every book is a failure. And that interesting idea that, like, again, you can see that it's not, that he's sort of resisting the idea of success. If something's perfect, then you should stop doing it. If you've written if you've perfected a style, then the style is not going to work anymore. And we might want to think about this in relation to 1984, why he wants to resist the idea of like the perfect novel or the perfect piece of writing. And again, a lot of this has to do with desire. I have tried to write, I hope to write, I want to write. And it's almost as though, or this would be one way to look at it, that writing is less about kind of giving us a stable image of the world than of transmitting some sense of desire. And part of what I'm interested in with 1984 is how it activates the reader's own agency. So what is it that pulls us into this novel, and the deeply personal way that we kind of open up to this novel, and the sense that so many people have that there's something about 1984 and about Orwell's writing that connects to how we want to think about politics, right? So less that it connects to our ideology or our ideas, then that maybe it connects to what it means to sort of be a political thinker or to think about politics. Here's another quote that I find really resonant with Orwell's work. It is not possible for any thinking person to live in such a society as our own without wanting to change it. And this seems to me to speak to part of the way that there's something about 1984 that seems to translate into quite different political circumstances. So we have strong feelings about different political events and political crises. And I'm thinking again of Inauguration Day in 2017. I also just want to emphasize this phrase "thinking person" and how much of 1984 is actually concerned with thinking. So maybe the key thing to remember about 1984 is just how much it is inside Winston Smith's head, And of course, it's divided. The novel is divided into 3 parts, and the entire first third of the novel is pretty much in some ways it's almost like Robinson Crusoe. It's almost like Winston Smith is very isolated, and there's something deeply private and introspective about this novel, and I think this connects to these questions about writing. So we might want to think for Orwell, in all of his work, there's a deep connection between the complexity of thinking and the complexity of writing.
So let me ask you just one quick question about that. It certainly seems that and this may be true of all literature or at least certain pieces of art, but in your view as an educator, whether it's Stanford undergrad or a parent perhaps,
Yeah.
or even giving suggestions to our audience tonight, do you feel like it's critical for students to understand Orwell, the person, the writer, the context, in order to understand 1984? Are the two? Are you suggesting that you really have to teach about both, or can 1984 be just as powerful without that context?
I mean, it's a good question, you know. So I think there is a lot to be gained uh, by bringing not so much the person, although the person's certainly really interesting, but the writing, you know, Orwell's other writing, into play, you know. So, but I guess part of what I would say is that, I mean, obviously, you know, a lot of people come to Orwell and they haven't read anything else, and there's no need to. I mean, the novel works on its own. You know, I think that Orwell as a writer is almost more interested in like the process of writing than the product of writing, I guess is what I'd say. And so, you know, 1984 is like one big step in the process. It's one of his most ambitious efforts to kind of take on these political questions, you know. But I think what's most important is to realize that there's lots of different, like there's lots of different writing that he does to take on these same questions. So yeah, I mean, obviously there's some responsibility for context, and I do think, you know, with 1984 there really are two contexts. So the students need to know a little bit about the 1940s, about World War II, about Stalinism, about totalitarianism. You know, you need to know a little history, but I do think there's a way that to understand the novel, you also need to know a little bit about that stream of writing that comes before it. And I mean, one thing we're going to talk about Winston Smith's journal, you know, but it's in. I mean, you know, I think one thing I would like students to sort of get out of 1984 is that almost like that the novel should turn them from readers into writers, you know, and thinking about like the meaning, like what does it mean to write a journal? Why would Winston Smith write a journal, and what would it mean for us to write a journal, you know, or for us to, let's say, to write a journal about politics, or to write our thoughts about politics, you know. And I think what Orwell's work offers is the model of becoming really active about one's politics, you know, and not active in the sense of like going to marches or going to demonstrations, but before you go to a march or before you go to a demonstration, there's writing, and even before that, there's thinking, you know. And I mean, you know, Orwell's. I mean, 94 is largely about like the effort to break from orthodoxy or to think for oneself, you know, and the difficulty of doing that. So, um, so I'm not sure if that might be a really roundabout way of answering your question, but I guess the shorthand would be, I don't think it's super important that, like, you know, somebody reads everything else that Orwell has written in order to read 1984. But I do think that part of what 94, part of the stakes of 1984 is about like the actual act of writing, you know, and
Right,
like what
right.
its meaning could be.
Great.
So
Super.
uh,
Thank you.
great, yeah. And then this is a little bit. I think this is our last. We are going to get to the novel, hopefully. I have all these passages beforehand, but I do find these super interesting. And Orwell is so great at these pithy phrases. But so again, attention here. This quote is act as sort of highlighting what it means to want political change. And he equates like being a thinking person with wanting change. And here's another quote that talks about how difficult change is. So uh, he has this. This is again from Charles Dickens. Progress is not an illusion; it happens, but it is slow and invariably disappointing. There is always a new tyrant waiting to take over from the old, generally not quite so bad, but still a tyrant. Consequently, two viewpoints are always tenable. The one, how can you improve human nature until you have changed the system? The other, what is the use of changing the system before you have improved human nature? They appeal to different individuals, and they probably show a tendency to alternate in point of time. The moralist and the revolutionary are constantly undermining one another. And one of the classic questions to ask about 1984 is how pessimistic is it? How does it balance hope and despair? Um, in Orwell's, again, I think you can get into the complexity of Orwell's politics by holding in line that sense, that any thinking person, how could we live in a society such as our own without wanting to change it? And then this difficulty of how change can be possible. That as long as human nature is the way it is, how are things going to change? But like, as long as society is the way it is, how is human nature going to change? Um, so these are some of the issues that I was hoping we could touch on today. First of all, the many depictions of writing in 1984, beginning with the journal. And then all these scenes in the novel that take place really quickly, like where there's sort of a freeze frame, a slow motion on these events that take place in a very short period of time, and what we might make of that, what Orwell is up to with these scenes where really consequential things happen quickly. Related to that are different moments of interruption in the novel. And an interruption is always something that's sudden, calling attention to that suddenness, and then finally thinking about the novel as again, less putting forward a point of view than sort of exploring what it means to have a point of view, or how we can try to arrive at a point of view, a political point of view. How do we make judgments about our own society when we're in that society? And I'm thinking here of Winston's struggle to. He doesn't really, like, he's locked in a society where there's no alternatives that are visible, but he's desperate to find some vantage point from which he can judge his own society. And I do think that's, we don't live in the kind of dystopian totality, the kind of dystopian prison that Orwell's depicting. But I think this question of like how you can step outside the society you're in to really imagine a kind of alternative is one of the profound takeaways from the novel. So here was a little catalog of some of the many different kinds of language and writing that we get in 1984, and this is, it's more an open question to the audience. What do we make of this? How does it change the novel to sort of, or how does it change our sense of the novel to pay attention to how many nested kinds of writing there are within Orwell's writing? So the novel as a whole, as I said, is this very ambitious piece of writing, and then Orwell folds so many kinds of writing into it, beginning with the journal, but we also have the book, and the book is kind of a mirror to 1984, right? Because 1984 has three parts, and then the book has three parts, and Orwell makes a lot about those three parts. And then conversely, we have Julia's note, which is only 3 words. I love you, and yet is an incredibly powerful political piece of political writing. So both of these, I mean, the thing about both of these first 2 examples is they are both forms of political writing. And so is 1984 itself. So immediately we can start to think about Julia as a writer, the book as a piece of writing, and then 1984. We have those slogans: war is peace, ignorance is strength. Again, you'll notice those are also all 3 words. We have the song, the children's song, that is gradually reconstructed across the novel. So it's almost like there's something about like putting together that song that maps onto the entire unfolding of the novel. And then there's this other kind of writing that's going on. And I think we're supposed to imagine that as the novel is progressing, the whole time the party is working on this new edition of the dictionary of Newspeak, which is going to be this sort of much more advanced version of this extremely distorted language. We have other kinds of writing coming out of the Ministry of Truth. You know, Julia and Winston are both writers of different kinds. And Julia, you know, is like there's that moment of recognition where like we hear about these novels being produced by machine, and of course we're reading a novel. So this is another point where, you know, one of the things I'm trying to get at is the way that all of these kind of texts within the text, lots of them are mirroring in different ways the very piece of political writing that we're reading. Um, and then the super important work that Winston does at the Ministry of Truth. And of course, what's most interesting about Winston's work is that he really loves it. You know, he loves the act of writing. I mean, this is a good example of kind of Orwell's making a point of separating or calling our attention to the activity of writing against the content, because Winston Smith hates the content of what he's producing, but he's very it's one of the it's one of the forms of escape for him is actually the active work of I mean his work. It's a refuge. Um, and then we can think of various descriptions of speech. I mean, and I'm using these two examples. On the one hand, the description of duck speak, which is this great. Um, it's an image of language melting into complete meaninglessness, right? Where the words almost cease to have any sense. And then conversely, we have these descriptions of Julia's what Julia calls talking in installments. But again, in each of these cases, these are all writing. These are all forms of writing or textuality or representation that are kind of encased within the novel, and then finally the photograph, which is not a piece of writing, but certainly is a form of representation. So I'm happy to go off on any of those, or we can keep marching ahead.
I think marching ahead, it's you're I think putting some really tight and nice frames on this conversation, and I can see from the comments in the chat box that teachers are sort of hovering above what they do with their students right now to just sort of understand this. But lots of good points have come out.
Yeah.
Alan, and I was sort of going to save this question for a little bit later, but I think Alan
Sure.
from Leadville has asked, do we have duck speak in our political arena today or as individuals? And at some point, I'm going to ask you to sort of map this onto our contemporary times.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I mean, maybe I'll take a first step and just say one of the things I like about that is the two different questions. Like, do we have it in our political arena, and individuals, those two different modes, and thinking about our own language too. I mean, I think that's part of it. Like, we don't want to move too quickly. Remembering Orwell's point about the provocation of setting this novel in his own society, in England rather than in Russia or in some imaginary land that sort of is other to England. So yeah, I mean, duck speak, and this is part of why readers are able to connect with this text, even if they're not that interested in like wartime 1940s London. And they're in a totally different social context, but duck speak, the political speech that seems to be kind of devoid of meaning, almost to the part where it just becomes sound, is prevalent. And yeah, maybe we can hold that question as we think about the journal. And I'm posing this as I do think the novel kind of provokes these questions at the beginning. And why might Orwell have decided to start 1984 with this attention to the journal? Um, how important is the journal to the plot? And I guess right away I'll just flag one thing about this. One answer to this is it's just an effective way of kind of showing the world, right? That he's talking about. So before he gets into the plot, um, by having Winston write about the society, we're kind of getting introduced to the society. Um, so in that sense, the journal isn't so much part of the plot, but it's more like a kind of just an introductory device. But in another sense, the whole plot kind of hinges on Winston Smith's decision to write this journal, and in a way, it's a really important event and not just a kind of window, if you want to use that word. And remember, good prose is like a window pane. Remember that idea. So, um, and I also think we want to think really seriously about the kind of strangeness of you pick up a novel and like it's a piece of writing, and then right away we get this other writing that's being dramatized in the novel. So I think one thing that journal is doing is kind of it's making us not forget that this is that this is all like writing. So another question is just why does Winston Smith decide to start writing a journal? And it's really interesting because the novel gives a bunch of different reasons for why he does this. Again, 1984 doesn't only start with a journal, but starts with someone starting a journal. Is this significant? And I think it is. And so I just wanted to really focus on some passages where what's so interesting to me about it is that we get these. It's very interesting the way he puts this together because he doesn't just give us entries from the journal, right? He gives us. He kind of jumps. I mean, the narrator is jumping in and out of what Winston writes, and then these descriptions actually of writing. And I'll start with this beautiful little detail about like this kind of totally random, accidental feature of his flat. To one side of it, there was a shallow alcove in which Winston was now sitting, which, when the flats were built, had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen, so far as sight went. It was partly the unusual geography of the room that had suggested to him the thing that he was now about to do. So that's one reason that's given for why he writes a journal, right? And if we understand the journal as like, the journal is not just expressing Winston's beliefs, but it's actually a vehicle through which he can kind of fully understand his own beliefs, right? And I mean, so this is the question I'd want to take out of this passage. Why do we have this is to the audience, why do we have like, how, Andy, you asked me, like, when did I first read 1984? And it's that same biographical question, like, when and why did we arrive at our own political views, and what led us to that, and what combination of accident and necessity? Is there some? So I think this is a kind of parable for kind of arriving at a political position, and I just love the way that you need this. He needs this little outlet. And you could imagine a lot of versions of this, of some little break in the system that allows Winston to even have the idea of writing. If it hadn't been for this, and I mean, Orwell emphasizes that it's a very small space. It's just this tiny little glitch almost in the apartment. And then he goes on and gives another reason, but it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. And then we get the account of how Winston had sort of stumbled, and again, this is sort of accidental. And I think it's interesting for anyone to think about like one's own political ideology and think and to try to be reflective about how one gets to that point of view. Is it by the people we encounter? Is it by the books we read? Um, is it by a random walk that we took and then Winston wanders off. He runs into this old shop, and he finds this book. And now I just want to look at a couple of descriptions of writing. For some time, he sat gazing stupidly at the paper. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten what it was that he had originally intended to say. Think about that. Every book is a failure, and right away, there's a kind of there's a sense of writing as not. It doesn't work exactly as you think it's going to work. It's not so simple as just you have ideas and then the ideas flow out of your pen onto paper. For weeks past, he had been making ready for this moment, and it had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. And again, all he had to do was to transfer to paper the interminable, restless monologue that had been running inside his head literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose ulcer had begun itching unbearably. And, among other things, you can kind of see Orwell, the writer, here. It's like Orwell definitely relates to this, like, as does any writer. The sense that, like, sometimes you go to work and the ideas just don't flow. You thought you knew what you were going to write, but like suddenly you're just you have a headache, or your back hurts, or your ulcer is itching. But I also want to point to that. He was curious, but he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself. And this is, that's a classic phrase for Orwell. Throughout his writing, he has this idea of like, it was curious. These ways that we notice things. So Winston Smith isn't just sort of blocked from writing, but then he sort of realizes he's blocked from writing, and that work of reflection is really important. So he realizes. So then a couple more interesting passages. His eyes refocused on the page. He discovered that while he sat helplessly musing, he had also been writing as though by automatic action, and it was no longer the same cramped, awkward handwriting as before. So there's another weird split in the writing. On the one hand, the writing doesn't just directly express thoughts. Here, he notices again, and it's what I'm interested in is this process of sort of noticing his. This is maybe what the point of writing a journal is, that you learn things about yourself. And how seriously do we all take the proposition that there might actually be things that you learn about yourself only through writing? So that the point of the journal isn't that you have some strong sense of yourself and then you just put it down on paper, but that you can actually develop yourself only through this act, and that raises the stakes of writing a journal. And I like to pose to my students that question of, to sort of put themselves in Winston's shoes. What would it mean to take politics seriously enough that you need to like write about politics, and what would it mean to not feel that you need to do that kind of writing? And then more details still. And you'll notice I'm not quoting. There's other passages in the beginning of 1984 that just transcribe Winston's writing, but these are all descriptions of writing. And it's part of what draws us in. This is how we first get intimately kind of pulled into this character's life. Suddenly he began writing in sheer panic, imperfectly aware of what he was setting down. Winston stopped writing, partly because he was suffering from cramp. Notice that partly, again, more than one reason. There's a constant question in this novel about like, why do we do things? And particularly, why do we think things? And particularly, why do we think things about politics? Um, so he stops writing, and it's only because he stops writing that he sees something else. He did not know what had made him pour out the stream of rubbish. But the curious thing was that while he was doing so, a totally different memory had clarified itself in his mind. And there's that curious thing again. And there's that self-discovery again. It was, he now realized, because of this other incident, that he had suddenly decided to come home and begin the diary today. And what an odd thing to discover as you're writing. What does he discover? He discovers why he started writing. Um, so rather than like, here's the reason why Winston wants to write, and now he goes about writing. He starts writing. Remember that line from Orwell about like, why do we write? You know, it might just be some demon that we don't really fully understand. Um, and in fact, this is you know, it's only in writing the journal, or it's almost like the point of writing the journal is to discover why he wants to write the journal, and that's what makes him recollect the trip to the junk shop. Um, and this is the end of the first chapter and the beginning of chapter 2. And I won't read the whole passage, but it's an interesting break. It's interesting, and you know, this is another thing to think about. Like where this conversation sort of leads is all the little decisions that go into Orwell's own construction of 1984. So it's kind of like Orwell starts by showing us the complexity of writing any piece of anything, you know, any text. And he gives us all these ins and outs of the process of writing, and then we have, you know, this carefully organized book itself. Why does Orwell put his book into 3 parts? You know, why does he break the chapter here? It's a curious place to break the chapter. There was a knocking at the door. He got up to move the door. He got up and moved heavily toward the door. Um, and once again, I just want to point out, once again, what we get with this detail is like Winston not realizing something and then suddenly realizing it. That process again of sort of ever more knowledge about himself. Uh, as he put his hand to the doorknob, Winston saw that he had left the diary open on the table. Down with Big Brother was written all over it in letters almost big enough to be legible across the room. It was an inconceivably stupid thing to have done. But he realized, even in his panic, he had not wanted to smudge the creamy paper by shutting the book while the ink was wet.
So I'm gonna take just a moment and offer you a question that Jacob Weingart has asked, and it's been sort of lingering as you've gone through these passages, and I sort of let it sit there on purpose, thinking, and I hope this is the case, that these passages all sort of tie into this. Jacob asks, is it possible that the journal is symbolic of the book itself, 1984, and that Orwell felt that he needed to write it being this forbidden book, to the future as a warning against totalitarianism?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I do think it's interesting to think about Winston Smith as a kind of avatar for Orwell, but also the act of writing the journal as an avatar for what Orwell does, which is to write, and not just to write this novel, but to do all the writing that he does. And I think it's quite beautiful to think about that deeply personal, again, kind of private sense that Winston has of his writing. His hope that he's writing to a future. He's writing to this indeterminate future. And to think of 1984 in that way. And of course, we've already discussed the ironies of history, that you know, Orwell kind of dies before he's able to really experience the fame that this novel, to some degree Animal Farm as well, but even more so 1984 would bring him. And then posthumously, the novel does find so many of its readers. But I think the other thing, I guess the other, like if we can, so yes, I think the writing in 1984 should make us remember Orwell, the writer, and should make us conscious of the writing. But I think it also points. I think on some level, it's supposed to point to the reader. It's supposed to be a provocation to the reader, and raise this question about our own political beliefs, and our own political thinking. I guess my takeaway from the journal is that it's not an easy thing to write. That's kind of like, it's a struggle, as Orwell puts it. And the novel is proposing that it's a very important thing to do. That it's both difficult and important. And obviously, yeah, I think obviously writing in 1984, Orwell feels that that the stakes are really high. There's a kind of urgency. There's an obvious urgency to this kind of writing. But I think he is, and I would speak for Orwell in this one thing, which is that I do think Orwell is very invested in the agency of his readers. What he doesn't want is for readers to simply be passive, to sort of to consume his thinking and his writing, and then just be filled up with orthodoxy. At least that's one way that I read this kind of detail in the book. And it's a really interesting question, because on some level, 94 is a book that has such a strong message, in one sense. And what do we do with the message? We just receive it. And you could certainly see the book as very manipulative. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's that it sort of is designed like that. The design of the book is to kind of affect the reader and just move the reader toward a particular point of view. And I think I'm trying to suggest maybe a different way to take what Orwell's up to. Partially, it's not so clear in some ways what the message of the book is. Again, if we think about what if we think about the the proles are the classic example of this, and I have some quotes about this. Whether the depiction of the proles is a source of hope or just a kind of further layer of despair, and whether writing 1984, I think people could. I think it's very fair to take Orwell to task for being too fatalistic and too pessimistic in this book. But my view of it is that he doesn't want to give the reader easy answers, in part because he wants the reader to I think he wants to turn readers into writers, I guess is what I would say. Particularly if you take seriously that writing is a really important part of thinking. So all of that is at stake for me in starting this book with this kind of intimate depiction of somebody trying to write a political journal. And yeah, this is the last detail, and it's a super strange one, because it's like a sort of he goes down to just the single particle of dust. And I think every reader feels it's a slightly strange moment for a novel to focus on just like a single grain of dust. And at the end of the novel, it turns out that like the thought police have also been that attentive, and that's sort of chilling. But also look at that first sentence, look at the dust in that first sentence. And this, of course, is the last this is the end of chapter 1. So chapter 1 ends with this line, with this single grain of dust, and the first opening of the first opening sentence also has this swirl of dust. So I think it's, well, I was going to say it's hard not to sort of notice this strange kind of framing of the opening chapter with this image of dust. First the swirl of dust, and then the one little particle of dust. But again, it just begs the question. It raises a question to the reader. How do we? Why? What's Orwell up to with this start, with this opening, and then coming back to that single particle of dust at the end of the chapter?
Alex, I want to keep us on track as well. It's about 5 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 20 minutes or so.
Yeah. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was these scenes where things happen really quickly, and I will just lay out my sort of view of this at the front, and then most of these passages I really want to just share with the audience, and if people have thoughts about these passages, and particularly why this novel has all these scenes where things happen really quickly. And I guess I want to connect it to, again, the activity of writing as we've been looking at it. That, those little moments of self-realization that we see on Winston's part, the question of timing, the little details, like the details of the grain of dust or the alcove with the tiny space. Orwell's idea that really eventful things happen really quickly, because I suppose that it again is, a lot of it is the drama of the mind rather than actions. So how do we kind of come to political viewpoints? How do we struggle against dogma and orthodoxy? So there's a series of scenes where things happen really quickly. This is, I think, this is the passing of the note, and we already talked about, like, I think there's a lot. I mean, just like we could compare the novel to the journal, in a way, Julia is the best writer of them all, because nothing packs such a political punch as that brief note that she hands to Winston Smith. And it's really interesting to think about how those 3 words, "I love you," can be a piece of language that has such power for all of us. It's an incredible example, really, of the strange power that language can have. And in the case of 1984, that note, I think we all sense that if Julia had written more, it would have conveyed less, and it clearly has a kind of political meaning. But I'm just going to read the passage before we get to the note. "And with that, she walked on in the direction in which she had been going, as briskly as though it had really been nothing. The whole incident could not have taken as much as half a minute. Not to let one's feelings appear in one's face was a habit that had acquired the status of an instinct, and in any case, they had been standing straight in front of a telescreen when the thing happened. Nevertheless, it had been very difficult not to betray a momentary surprise, for in the 2 or 3 seconds while he was helping her up, the girl had slipped something into his hand." And I'll just anticipate some of the other passages that I put on the presentation. You have you have the momentary meeting of eyes between O'Brien and Winston Smith, and then you have the photograph that he holds in his hand, just very briefly, and then it gets destroyed. But in all these passages, Orwell is juxtaposing two time frames. I mean, one is like here we get the habit, these kind of ingrained ways of acting, and then these flashes of action or insight that take place really quickly. And again, we might want to think about 1984's own enduring reputation. We might want to remember that passage where Orwell says, like, the novelist that repeats himself is sort of lifeless. Any novelist, any writer that just keeps writing the same thing is lifeless. Even as he also says, everything I've written has had the same political orientation. And here are some of the other moments around this passing of the note. Perhaps the brotherhood existed after all. Perhaps the girl was a part of it. No doubt the idea was absurd, but it had sprung into his mind in the very instant of feeling the scrap of paper in his hand. And I just want to call attention to that. It sprung into his mind in the very instant. Because Orwell is so interested in these thoughts that kind of arise instantaneously. And again, I think we all want to take this to heart and think about our own kind of how we develop and then navigate our own political views. And do we have the kind of minds that are open to being surprised? And how can you have a politics that is at once consistent and also not, overly orthodox or dogmatic? So this phrase sprung into his mind, the idea that sprang into his mind, this gets to what, if we have time, will be the final question of the webinar, which is just how do we know things? How do we make judgments? How do we come to political understanding? And then there's that note. On it was written in a large unformed handwriting, "I love you." For several seconds, he was too stunned even to throw the incriminating thing into the memory hole. Here's the meeting with O'Brien, where again we see the space of a couple of seconds, exactly at this moment, a fraction of a second, when their eyes met and the flash of intelligence was gone. So I guess the general point is that Orwell wants to insist that there's something about political thinking that's very fragile and kind of ephemeral and spontaneous. The other way to understand these scenes, of course, is that that's just because there's such a sort of heavy surveillance at all points that things have to take place quickly. And here's a slightly different example, a kind of political insight that arises because, like, Winston is just in the right position to see this thing in this way, and I think this is the duck speaker. His head was thrown back a little, and because of the angle at which he was sitting, his spectacles caught the light and presented to Winston two blank discs instead of eyes. And I'm just calling attention to that because of the angle at which he was sitting. Otherwise we. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Let me ask you a quick question. Actually, Alan Johnson's is passing it through me. Where are the thought police at this point?
With the journal or with this particular scene?
I'm going to interpret his question as being the scene, but I'm going to ask Alan for you to expand on that question if you like in the chat box.
I will say this. So this meeting with O'Brien, of course, like O'Brien turns out to be.
Thanks, Alan. He means the scene.
Yeah. I'm going through a few different scenes, but this scene with his spectacles caught the light is in the cafeteria, I believe, like in the Ministry of Truth. So it's when he's observing, it's like when he's having the lunch in the canteen, and yeah, I mean, I'll say about the thought police are, again, we get that emphasis on just thought, and if we think about double think and these phrases, thought police, double think, it's a different way that the question of thinking is very much at stake in this novel. And what's the great political fear in 1984 is not that your body can be controlled or that or harmed, but the idea that like your thinking itself can be changed, can be penetrated and observed and changed. This is another instance of Julia and Winston holding hands for 10 seconds. Notice that again. In the same instant, it occurred to him that he did not know what color the girl's eyes were. I think I'll skip that scene, and I'll move on to a related theme, which is these moments of where the novel kind of interrupts itself, and this is the most striking example, and this is really a question. If anyone has thoughts about this, either in their reading of it or in teaching the novel. We have this, the photograph, which is this really important event in the novel, and Orwell is just about on the cusp of introducing this memory. So this is all from Winston's point of view, early on. But you could prove nothing. There was never any evidence. Just once in his whole life, he had held in his hands unmistakable documentary proof of the falsification of a historical fact. And on that occasion, Smith screamed the shrewish voice from the telescreen. And Winston is asked to do exercise, and he forgets it. I mean, his thoughts change; they go into something else, and this is dropped. But it's not just dropped by the character; it's also dropped by the novel. And about 40 pages later, Winston Smith's mind circles back to this scene, and we get almost an exact repetition of the passage. Everything faded into mist. The past was erased. The erasure was forgotten. The lie became truth. Just once in his life he had possessed, after the event, that was counted, concrete, unmistakable evidence of an act of falsification. He had held it between his fingers for as long as 30 seconds. So just once in his whole life, he had held it in his hands. And then just once in his life, he had possessed after the event. It's very odd. It's a very odd little, what would you call this? A little slip in the novel. Or Orwell kind of deliberately interrupting himself, interrupting his own novel, and holding off on this piece of plot. And so my question about this is, what's Orwell up to? What would be some of the reasons why a novelist would, remembering the title of this webinar, The Art of Political Writing? Why make this choice to literally, cut the narrative off on this important, in retrospect, we realize this is a really important event, and then return to it. So, I mean, we can move on, but this is really an open question. If anyone wants to comment on this little odd interruption.
We'll pause for a moment and see if folks have some some thoughts or some feedback. I get the sense that all these are all of your questions and all of what you're contextualizing here is kind of pulling together for folks. But
Sure.
Given that we have about 10 minutes or so, why don't you move forward and I'll mine the chat box, and if there's anything,
Yeah.
I'll bring.
So, I basically the next thing were just a couple other examples of these sort of odd, like, well, I guess what you call these odd moments, and one, of course, is when he reads the book within the book, that 3-part book within the novel, and there's lots of odd things about the way that Winston Smith goes about reading it, And I mean, I just chose a scene where it's like there's a paragraph. He starts. I mean, it's exactly like the holding off. He starts reading chapter 1 and then decides to put it down, and there's this, and then opens it at chapter 3, and then we get all of chapter 3, and then the novel circles back to give us all of chapter 1, and we never get chapter 2. So we never. I mean, again, think about like every book is a failure, and the way that Orwell, decides not to give us all of the book within the book, even as he gives us so much of it. And here's another little interesting interruption. This time, not by the novel, but by the characters, where Winston Smith. I'll just read it. Has it ever occurred to you, Winston, that by the year 2050, at the very latest, not a single human being will be alive who could understand such a conversation as we are having now? Except, began Winston doubtfully, and then stopped. It had been on the tip of his tongue to say, except the proles. And then Sim has divined what he was about to say. The proles are not human beings, he said carelessly. And again, I'm interested in Orwell's kind of attention to these nuances of thinking, of conversation. It's rather fascinating that we get this I mean, first that we get this depiction of him stopping and not saying what he was going to say, and then Sim being able to know what he says and to completely repudiate it.
I've got a couple of actually a comment and a question I'd like to bring in. The first is a comment from Joshua Sensenbaugh, who says, the pause feels like it runs in the same vein as the journal. One function might be as a counter of time, like grains of sand in an hourglass. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I'm just gonna think about that for a second. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it seems apt to me. I mean, I think that, right. I guess oh, that's my dog.
That's the beauty of long distance working.
Hey, Lexi. Every dog.
Alex, this is going to go. This is going to go viral now, right?
I know it should. I'm thinking every dog has their day. This is Lexi's big moment.
It sounds like you're going in someone's window and someone's dog is protecting his house.
That's true. She's at the window, just like now we're getting a lot of comments. I like that.
Yeah, we are. Now that we got the Animal Farm kind of comments.
And I will tell you, I mean, as a point of trivia, Orwell's own dog was called Marx, which I think is pretty funny. So
that's good.
Yeah, but Orwell was quite the animal lover. But yeah, I think that it does make sense to think about the pause and the passage of time. I guess
Well,
that would be. Oh, go ahead, Andy.
before you get pulled away pulled away by your dog, I'm going to ask
Yeah.
you one. I'm going to bring one other question in, which is from Jacob, who asks,
Okay.
and this is a little bit far off what we were talking about, but he asks, do you have any thoughts on Orwell's projection of the world forming into superstates, hating each other for the same thing they do to themselves and waging pointless war on each other?
Yeah, it's a great question, um, and there's lots to think about that. But one thought I have, which comes to mind, is just part of what's resonant about this idea of like these three super states. Is these like just this idea of these kind of closed, completely closed worlds or thought worlds, completely closed thought worlds, sealed off, kind of self-sufficient, impenetrable from the outside, and then a constant war. And if you think about our political divide, like in the U.S. and the red and the blue,
Alex,
has,
I have a sense that you're leaning down to scratch your dog so it doesn't bark. But I'm going to bring you back to the microphone if possible.
sorry, yeah, sorry, I was moving around, but uh, there's a little bit of that. I mean, I feel like there's some version of that today, not with super states, but just with these sealed off thought worlds, like in, on social media or in domestic politics, which I think Orwell would be attentive to. These kind of bubbles that everyone is in,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of political ideology. I think Orwell is very afraid of any kind of completely self-reinforcing system. So, uh,
Good,
yeah.
thank you.
So, yeah.
Well, we have just a few more minutes, and I know you've got a handful of slides here. I might ask you to pick out sort of your next last takeaway point.
Yeah, I think we're pretty. I think we could just. I mean, I have a long passage, which is this scene where, where Winston Smith evokes the idea of ancestral memory, um, and basically, it is the scene that I sort of mentioned at the beginning of how can he. I mean, it's exactly like being in this closed world. I mean, in his case, a closed thought world and a closed political world, and this sense that he has, a kind of inchoate sense that there must be an alternative, and he's trying to grasp, how and where he can locate that, and it's a rather beautiful description, uh, that sort of recounts like all the things that are sort of shoddy in the world. As long as he could remember, there had never been quite enough to eat. Had never had socks or underclothes, rooms underheated, filthy tasting, coffee filthy tasting, cigarettes insufficient, you know, um, uh, the dirt and the scarcity, the interminable winters, the stickiness of one's socks. Um, why should one feel it to be intolerable unless one had some kind of ancestral memory that things had once been different? Uh, and so that phrase ancestral memory is doing a lot of work, and he goes back to that phrase later on, and yeah, I think it's as good a place to end as any on that passage. When
Good.
Yeah,
Well, so I've got a couple of final questions for you then, and I'm
sure,
seeing some others are coming in as well. I'm going to
sure.
actually start with Robert Dominic's question. He asks, does this phrase have any connection to the idea of the collective unconscious? And again, Alex, I'm going to ask you to bring just a little bit closer to the microphone.
Yeah. Uh, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. Probably not. I don't think in Orwell's. I'm going to give a kind of funny, silly answer to this, but I don't think in Orwell's mind intentionally it would have that connection. But it's possible that that he's drawing himself on a kind of larger zeitgeist, that would connect it. I think what he means by ancestral memory is very vague. It's very elusive, and it gets into this question of like where, I mean, going back to like the sort of vicious loop between human nature and society, and how can we possibly really change the world when we have to sort of simultaneously change human nature and like the social structure at the same time. So
Right.
because I guess the collective unconscious is just like thinking of like Carl Jung or something. So, yeah.
Excellent. One final question for you, and I warned you earlier I was going to ask you to do this, but it's not just January of 2017, and it may not just be in the context of the world that we find ourselves in April of 2018, but 1984 has returned to the bestsellers list several times in the last decade, 2 decades. It clearly has purchase with sort of a contemporary lens. And maybe actually what it does is it gives us words, even if they seem to be sort of made up words, but it gives us a language for this kind of weird, complex world that we're living in, this alternative fact world that we're suddenly being asked to consider. How do you individually, as an educator at a university level or as a scholar, how do you reconcile 1984 with the world that you wake up to every morning?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I mean, I'll just give you the thought that comes to the top of my head with this, which is, uh, I shared. It was easy for me to share in the, the general, like the spike in 1984, on Amazon.com. It was, I mean, it was coming, like it wasn't. I'm sure it wasn't everyone reaching for this. It was, it was people that were appalled by the turn of events in our country. I mean, the shocking results of the election. It was a partisan, it was a partisan feeling, and I share in that. And yet, it's quite interesting because Orwell is such a strong partisan, and yet, like if we think about the 2 minutes hate, and these depictions of just kind of political aggression gone amok, and like the kind of the aggression that we all feel on all sides, the anger and vitriol that oddly sort of defines us all, even though we have such diametrically different views. Orwell is pretty interesting on that as well. I mean, even as he's such a strong partisan, he's also thinking about like the 2 minutes hate. He's the perfect diagnoser of kind of, I mean, just the dangers of political anger that are running through our time, very sadly and scarily. So,
and do you think, again, without presuming that we can speak for him, but if his
yeah.
voice is this book and it's the lens we're using right now, is it this notion that this is just the human turn of events, this is just the condition that we always have to be vigilant for, and that there is kind of a cyclical sense of this and it's going to happen, but books like 1984 or the conversation help. It's the antidote, right? It helps us kind of sort of respond to it when it does occur.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think again, that there's a sense that writing matters and reading matters, and in a way, yeah, I think Orwell does not think writing should have all the answers, and he's very skeptical of purely intellectual answers to the world's problems. But I think he's very committed to the meaning of the humanities. I mean, to go back to the context of this podcast. But it's tricky to know. It's tricky to know, especially. I mean, yeah, it's tricky to think. Orwell's also like what he would make of the internet is a kind of interesting question too. So
absolutely.
In some ways, what we're doing here is the complete opposite of the telescreen, and in other ways, it has maybe an eerie resemblance to it. So
you're right. So last question, and I mean it this time. I don't know the answer to this, so it may just be a simple no. Did George Orwell, the citizen, the author, did he have any strong opinions about education
Uh, yeah, that's a very interesting question. So the best place to look for that is the essay he wrote called "Such Were the Joys," which was his own autobiographical experience of going to a kind of pretty elite, as a kind of scholarship kid, going to a pretty elite boarding school. And it's a great essay about like the vulnerability of children to kind of institutional, like the kind of institutional cruelty that's possible in educational systems. Uh, and it's a pretty inspiring essay. So I think he's generally, uh, worried about. I mean, I think he's generally for educational equality, and he's kind of appalled by the hierarchical nature of education in England, which he both benefited from and kind of was a victim of. So,
Right. And
so I point,
give us the name of that essay one more time.
yeah. So the essay is called "Such Were the Joys,"
It's for the joys. Thank you.
and it opens with the scene of him wetting his bed when he was this little kid on his like the first weeks of going to boarding school and getting punished for that, and it's and kind of goes off from there. So, and it was so libelous toward his former teachers that it couldn't be published in his lifetime. So yeah.
uh, I think that's a great place to end. And I really want to thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to, at your suggestion, I'm going to put your
Yeah,
email
definitely.
address on the page there. And I don't think it's an idle invitation. If any of our audience members tonight have a follow-up question or would like to learn about some more resources with Orwell and specifically 1984, to shoot you an email.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to keep the conversation going. And thanks a lot, Andy, and to you and to your team. You guys know what you're doing with these. So it was
Thank,
fun to work with you.
thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight and for all of our webinars this year. Please follow the National Humanities Center on our social media, a very Orwellian thing to request. You can check us out on Facebook, on Twitter, which is very active, and Instagram, and get updates not only for our long distance opportunities, but also our face-to-face opportunities for our education bridge from the research that we do at the center. Again, tonight you will be prompted for an evaluation and a survey, and then after completing that, you'll be receiving a certificate for the completion of tonight's work. We have recorded tonight's session, and generally we get them on our YouTube channel within about 48 hours or so. I'm pleased that my colleague Libby Taylor is back from maternity leave, so they're going to get online quicker than they were earlier this semester. So if you'd like to go through and sort of linger on some of these comments and these passages, that's a good way to do so. The PowerPoint will also be available. I want to thank you again for joining us. We will open registration for the 2018-19 school year and academic year calendar on August the 13th, 2018 at 10 a.m. East Coast time. I hope to see you logging on then and signing up for another compelling slate of webinars for the new season. Have a great school day tomorrow. Have a great end of your school year, great summer preparation for the next one. We'll see you again next time with the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night.